Okay, so here we go. We have been in 2024 trying to go through the whole Bible. 230 miles an hour, we've been speeding by in the bullet train, looking at the landscape, and we've been taking a lot of it in, and we're getting a pretty good idea of where we are. We've got the road map. I'm trying to put the whole thing together so that we can put the little parts in so we understand where they belong. So we are now entering a whole new section of the Bible. We are now entering into the prophets. The prophets. Well, there's going to be two kinds of prophets, the major prophets and the minor prophets. What's the difference between them? The major prophets are the bigger books and the minor prophets are the smaller books. Kind of unfortunate because those minor prophets have a lot to say, and what they have to say is very important. And some of them in very short books have like amazing things to say, amazing fulfillments of their prophecies. Also, I guess maybe you could call them the early prophets and the later prophets. Well, the early ones, early in Israel's history, the later ones, later in Israel's history, including after the exile and the return from the exile. So what we're going to do is take a break for 1 week. So if you're watching this in real time, we're in the last week of May, and we'll be picking up again on Monday, June 3rd. But let's review where we were, and then maybe we can understand a little bit where we're going to be going with these prophets. Well, we've been going through the whole Bible, and we're, again, at a place where there's a big section of the Bible coming up, the prophets. So the way that it's gone for us so far is we've divided the Bible up into sections. And those sections that we've divided it up into are the law, which are the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And then after that, we have what we call the history books. And there are 12 of those history books. And then after the history books, we have what we call the poetry books. Now, it goes pretty much chronological from the first 5 books, which are known as the Torah, which are known as the Law of Moses, which are known as the first 5 books. Sometimes it's just called Moses. Sometimes it's called the Law. So those first 5 books. Pretty much chronological. Starts out Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And it ends with Deuteronomy, the second law, the second time that Moses gives the law to the children of Israel that came out of Egypt, came out of slavery. So, you've got pretty much chronological order there. Then when you get into the history books, it's pretty much chronological as well. It starts with the book of Joshua, where now that they've come out 40 years later, and it tells us this in the book of Numbers, that it was an 11-day journey, took them 40 years. But Joshua leads them into the land, and they conquer the land, and they divide it up among the 12 tribes, and they live there, and they're getting along. Until the book of Judges, when they're living there, and what happens is they have only God as their king. Kind of interesting, right? Like, we've been decades now with just having God as king, having no governor as such, having no president, having no prime minister, just God. The book of Judges takes 400 years. And in the book of Judges, there's this whole history of revival and decline, usually right around 40 years, and sort of cycle that happens. So that brings you to Joshua and to Judges. And then we enter into a new period, although we still call it the history books, we enter into a new period where it starts to be that the nation is being directed by prophets, And it also will be a time when they're going to be directed by earthly kings. In the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, we find the story of the earthly kings. It goes from God being king to having Saul being king to having David be king. It ends, and then it moves into a book called 1st and 2nd Kings, and that's about the kings. And there we have David's son Solomon takes over. After Solomon takes over, so he would have been the 4th king if you count God as the first. what happens is there's a civil war and the nation divides. It divides into the north and it divides into the south. So 10 tribes go into the north and 2 tribes go down into the south. And it becomes the history of those kings. And when you go through 1st and 2nd Kings, it gets very complicated because sometimes it's the kings in the north, sometimes it's the kings in the south that they're being written about. Then we get to 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which feels, if you're reading it, you go, this kind of feels like 1st and 2nd Kings. Am I reading 1st and 2nd Kings all over again? It's sort of, except that you're dealing primarily now with just what was happening with the kings in the south, who stayed pretty faithful to God. It took them a longer time before the nation completely fell apart. But it's about them and it's about their victories and who they are. And it's mostly about the good things that the kings did. Well, during this same time, during the time of the Civil War, as you're reading the Civil War, there's the North and the South, and what's happening is there are other nations around Israel that are gaining power. One of them is Assyria, and Assyria comes and conquers the north, and that's really sort of the demise of the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes, just sort of overtaken by Assyria. Well, the south, they hold out. They hold out a little bit longer, but eventually they are conquered as well, and they're conquered by Babylon. And when they're conquered by Babylon, Babylon leads them out, exiles them into Babylon, and it's there that they stay in Babylon. Well, eventually the prophet Jeremiah, which we'll be looking at in several weeks, the prophet Jeremiah had said they'd be there 70 years, and sure enough, 70 years they were there. All kinds of other amazing prophecies with Jeremiah and the other prophets saying what would happen to these people in exile, as well as some of the kings that would release them out of exile and help them to rebuild. So in the history books, you also have the rebuilding. And there you have Ezra and you have Nehemiah, you have Esther. So you have these books that are after they have come out. So those are the history books. And now we move into the prophets. Well, most of that is chronological, pretty much chronological. But when we get into the prophets, it's not going to be chronological. Well, then, I'm sorry, we got into the books of poetry, which were the books of Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. And most of those take place, except for Job, which very well may have been the first book ever written, not only the Bible, but first book ever written that we have recorded. Most of those happen during the early time of the kings, those Psalms and those Proverbs. Some of the Psalms go back to Moses, but for the most part, it's in that period. So then we get to the prophets. Well, here's the thing with the prophets, is that the prophets, some of them belong all the way back into the book of Kings. So it gets confusing, right? So we're going to take those prophets that are here and we're going to bring them all the way back into the time of the Kings. We're going to take these prophets and we're going to bring them all the way back into the time of the Chronicles. And then some of these prophets, they're going to go all the way back into the time of the exile. And then some of them are going to go back into the time of the return from exile. So we're going to try to place them all where they belong. And so we're not going to be looking at the Bible chronologically at this point. We're going to be looking at the books of the prophets chronologically and talking about them and talking about where they belong. And hopefully we can do this together, and hopefully we'll get it, and hopefully we'll understand it, and it will make sense to us the next time we read through these prophets, the major ones, the big prophets, the big long ones, or the minor ones, the small ones. Where do they belong, and where do they belong in the history of Israel, going from that time of the kings all the way into the return from the exile? Where do they go, and what are they talking about, and what words do they have? So it's going to be a blast. We're going to go through these prophets, and hopefully we'll cover them pretty good, and hopefully we'll understand where everything goes and where everything belongs. So stick with us. Make sure that you don't forget us, and come back on June 3rd, and maybe we'll send out a few things here and there. So keep watching for just some little sort of bonus things that we throw out to try to help us understand the Bible and to put the Bible together. So bless you guys. We will see you then. And maybe, like we said, a few little bonus things might go out in the in-between. So the prophets, will be hitting them up pretty soon. Hey, bless you guys. Love you.